Because our culture has quite a body-based idea of sexuality, when clients come to us, um, practitioners are often engaged in a funny kind of search with the client to find where their sexuality is. And often the assumption is that it's hidden under a lot of trauma. It's hidden under horrible experiences that have somehow stifled sexual expression, or something like that. And so the therapy process is often based around this lack of apparent sexuality. A completely different perspective to take is to inquire about the fantasy life of the client. Because almost everybody, or at least everybody that would consult a somatic sex therapist like myself, has sexual fantasies. They may not necessarily recognize them as fantasies. So often when you say sexual fantasies, people deny them because they think it's some kind of film score with a huge story to it. But almost everybody has sexual fantasies which can manifest in different ways. It doesn't need to be a story, it can be a series of images or imagined smells. It could be anything. Anything which isn't here and now and which we find erotically engaging is fantasy. So it's a very, very wide area. But people tend to be quite embarrassed in talking of their fantasies. I think because they think they're going to be judged. And the basis of that is an over-focus on the narrative. So very often people will have fantasies that at a narrative level they find embarrassing. So they might be voyeuristic kind of fantasies or being assaulted kind of fantasies. They're embarrassed about sharing these fantasies with other people and the implications that those other people might make about their nature, given what those fantasies appear to be about. But fantasies, like dreams, are not significant primarily at the narrative level. They're significant at the feeling level. Because what's encoded into the structure of the fantasy is emotion. And very common scenarios, so the scenario, for instance, of being subjected to indecent assault, for instance, that can have a whole range of possible meanings. So it's the emotional matrix underneath the narrative which interests me. If you're talking to a sexological bodyworker and this topic strays on to sexuality, they're likely to mention this book, which is Jack Moran's classic, The Erotic Mind. And Jack Moran's idea, and he's a psychotherapist, his idea is that we take pain, usually early hurts, early in our life, and as it were, we re-empower ourselves by eroticizing that pain. So an example he gives is that our early pain might have been that our elder sister was much more attractive than we were, and she got all the attention. And what we notice in our fantasy life is that we're always being subject to unwanted sexual attention from unsuitable men. And just think, what's the point of that fantasy? But when you take Moran's perspective on board, you can see it as a clear compensating function. There I was in a situation where I wasn't as attractive as my older sister, and now I'm so attractive that all these possibly horrible men just can't help themselves. I'm irresistible. So there's a way in which all fantasies meet not primarily a sexual need, but an emotional need expressed through sexuality. I think Jack Moran's perspective is very interesting, but I don't think it should be taken 100%. Not everybody can track their fantasies to some earlier experience for which they're then erotically compensating. But the underlying idea, which is that we should pay close attention to the needs that the fantasy meets, rather than dissect or attempt to reenact the fantasy itself, that is the key insight. Another thing about people's fantasies is that they tend to collapse over time. So originally, the fantasy is a kind of world, often a world which is experienced within the context of masturbation. But over time and repetition, the fantasy just kind of gradually contracts. And so one of the things that you can do in your work with me is that you can open up that fantasy again. And one of the ways in which that can be done, and I don't know if everybody can do this, but I found it works with quite a lot of people, is that there's an imaginative empathy that we can create. So if you start narrating your fantasy, and I can get a proper sense of it, in a sense I can continue that fantasy. That does several things. Firstly, it takes away shame and replaces it with empathy and understanding. But secondly, it opens up all the eroticism and creativity of the fantasy that's been closed down through repetition. And so we can start to see the kind of range of our internal life fantasy. And if we can see that, then I think we can start to see right in the centre of that our own sexual nature, our needs, our modes of expression, all of it. So fantasy is not there as a kind of substitute for anything. Like dreaming, it's there as a direct expression of our nature. It's very important. It does not deserve to be suppressed by shame. It deserves to be opened up and shared as part of our lived experience with other people. And it should be given expression in our functioning, our sexual functioning with other people.